I think in retrospect it is a classic album. U2 would go on to make better albums over time, but it was a very significant album for them.
In terms of U2's oeuvre, it's definitely up there. And I think, however grudging you might be to acknowledge U2 as a force to be reckoned with, I think War is proof that they really were.
I can't believe the news today.
Why the War album is important is because in it Bono shakes off the young, the children, adolescent thing. So there's less subconscious, I've got to be young and whooping and yelling, and there's much, the weight of the world is beginning to drop on his shoulders.
Broken bottles under children's feet. Everybody strewn across a dead-end street. But I won't heed the bell call. Puts my back up against the wall.
There's always going to be a gap in the market for a fantastic rock band with great songs. You know, there's the old record business maxim, you know, art for art's sake, hit singles for fuck's sake.
All is quiet on New Year's Day. A world quiet, it's on the way.
I was standing in the marquee watching U2. It's probably one of the first big gigs they did in London, and it was by then sold out and packed, and I was leaning against a pillar, and next to me was Bruce Springsteen, who'd come along to check him out, and I never met him before or since, but I was like, all right, Bruce, you know, I'd seen him at Wembley quite recently, and nice gig, what do you think? He was, you know, they're going to be huge in America, words to that effect, and he was right.
I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song.
I first came across U2 in 1979, I think. I was working at CBS Records as an A&R department, that's now Sony Records. And Paul McGuinness used to come to London on a regular basis with a suitcase full of tapes of all sorts of songs and bands and stuff from Dublin, trying to get deals on them. And he used to come and see me. Came to see me a couple of times, and each time he came, he one of the tapes he'd pull out would be of this new group that he'd got, and this new teenage group that he'd got, who he said were doing, you know, great things in Ireland, and they won a CBS Ireland talent competition, and he told me about that, and the photographs looked good, and I said I'd go over and see them play in Dublin.
There's a picture book with coloured photographs. There's a comic strip that makes me laugh. Sometimes a hero takes me, sometimes I don't want to know. Hello, hello, stories for boys, stories for boys, stories for boys.
Bono was fantastic. We saw them in a little club where half their audience couldn't get in because there was an age restriction. So the place was only half full, and Paul McGuinness was most apologetic about this. So anyway, they came on, and as a band they were a fairly ordinary new wave post-punk band. They weren't special as a group, but Bono was absolutely mesmerising. He had loads of stagecraft. He had lots of presence, and then he was jumping and running all over the stage. And in particular, he was doing a lot of classical tragic hero type acting sort of things like out of Shakespeare and stuff. In fact, he reminded me, when I was at university I saw Ian McKellen, a young Ian McKellen, doing some Jacobean tragedy, and Bono had all of those moves and all that kind of presence. And I remember saying to Howard that, shouting in his ear as you do at a gig, that either this guy's going to be he's either going to be a new sensational Alex Harvey, or he's going to be a new David Bowie. He's going to be one or the other. It's going to be big but not for long, or it's going to be big and it might be forever.
During my time at Zigzag, I built up a good relationship with the Island Records press office. Rob Partridge was always fixing me up with interviews, and one day he told me I could do this interview with Bob Marley that I'd been plugging away for a long time. Rob said, well, you could do me a favour. We've signed a band called U2, and do you want to go over there and do them for Zigzag? That would be, you know, it was kind of like a trade. I said, yeah, sure. So, as a favour to Rob, who apparently had been a massive champion for U2, he was probably mainly thanks to him they got signed to Ireland. Rob had heard a demo very early on, and he'd been badgering the rest of the company, sign this band U2, and they did. And I went over to Dublin, I met them. Bono met me at the airport, and with Paul McGuinness, and I had 2 days with U2, and they were very nice, and they took me up to what they called the Gingerbread House, which is where they rehearsed, and I saw them rehearsing up that 11 o'clock TikTok and all those early songs, and then we went to the pub for a pint of Guinness, and I had my first blast of Bono's theories of rock and roll, society, everything, and I thought, this band have got something. And obviously, they did.
I was on the outside when you say in need of me. I was looking at myself, I was blind, could not see. Sing now!
I'm certain that I discerned something special about them. They had a different take, you know, and they sort of had a different philosophy about it all. You know, they were staunchly 2-3 years after the event, they were bought into the punk thing, but somehow or other for all the idealistic reasons. You know, they were definitely they were anti-drugs, they were anti-posing, they were. Bono was particularly keen that they shouldn't, you know, sing about the same sorts of things that all other bands sing about, and he wanted to deal with things about sort of personal feelings and stuff. And the first couple of albums are all, if you look at 90% of the songs, are all dealing with, you know, Bono being the lyricist, of course, and so therefore voicing what the song's about. They're all about the individual trying to stand up and find his feet, you know. And then as their work goes on, they moved into broader themes, but they were much more introverted in their subject matter in the first 2-3 albums. Certainly the first 2 albums. They were really focused on the experience of being a child and being an early adolescent. The songs were all, and they were different in that respect. You know, they weren't about dole cues, and they weren't about, you know, the sort of stuff the Clash was singing about, or the Stranglers were singing about. They weren't world weary at all. They were very sort of fresh and I guess in retrospect spiritual, which is something obviously they developed later on. But that sort of feeling was in there, you know, from the beginning.
Your eyes make a circle, and I see you when I go in there. Yeah, but it's your eyes, but it's your eyes, your eyes,
War was the album that was the crossover for U2 really, because they started in 1981 with Boy, and it's a very kind of naive album. I mean, they've just had the teens, they're basically just stopped being teenagers, and it's very kind of raw, quite visceral, quite angry, but they hadn't really found the way to express the anger yet. It was quite unformed, quite inarticulate in some ways. And then they came out with October the next year, which was really kind of more the same, but not quite as, it didn't really work as well. It was a bit of a sort of step backwards, if anything. So with War, it was the first time they really sounded quite coherent and had a message, had something to say, and seemed capable of putting it across in a convincing fashion.
U2 were in trouble at that time, very much so. They were they went into making the album hugely in debt to Ireland. With October, their second album, they'd seriously thought about chucking it in, and The Edge has subsequently said that he had wondered whether he might quit the band. So that was the real problem. They were undecided. It was a really kind of stressful time for them. So the fact that they came out with such a forceful statement, and really their first great record, is quite a testament to their talent, I think, and to their strength as individuals and as a band.
War got to number one really on the strength of the hardcore fan base that they built up over the previous two albums and the tours that they'd undertaken. They had an incredibly loyal following at that point, and that following was enough to take the album to number one, where it actually displaced Michael Jackson's Thriller, which in itself is some kind of statement.
I think it's more a kind of refining the style that was hinted at on the first two albums, really. I mean, given the way that U2 have developed, and they're kind of chameleon-like, they've constantly evolved over the years, I think it's easy to forget that they were essentially a post-punk band when they emerged, and so there are kind of echoes of Echo and the Bunnymen, Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division. That's the sort of sound that they were coming from, but they did something much more with it. They made it much more declamatory and uplifting, and message-laden, less introspective, more outgoing.
Just before they recorded War, they took the unusual step of actually doing quite a lengthy tour of Britain, Ireland and some parts of Europe, where they were experimenting with a lot of the material that was going to be on the finished album. With War, they realised this was their big opportunity to get all the things right that they hadn't got right with the first two albums. They had more money to record, they had more time to record, and it was taken much more seriously by the record company. They were now an established band in Britain, at least, with hits behind them. So the whole idea was that War would be the album that broke them internationally, which is exactly what happened. So they took it much more seriously, took much more time, and they toured before the album, so that by the time they came to the studio to record the stuff, they were hot off the road. You know, there's a real difference between a group that's just come straight from a 2-month tour into a studio to a group that's even been rehearsing for a few weeks. There's a completely different ambience, a different vibe, a different proficiency, a different attitude. They were absolutely ready to rock, as they say. They also were much more familiar with the material, much more confident, and much more convinced about their abilities, and much less hung up about, are we punk? Well, we're Irish punk. Well, what is Irish punk? That can never compete with what's going on in London and Manchester. Okay, we've done that. What do we do with the second album? Well, it's got to be a bit like, all that stuff went completely out the window, and it was like, what are we going to do? Let's go in there and absolutely make this amazing.
Well, actually, The Edge went into studios in Dublin by himself because the rest of the band were on holiday. Bono was on his honeymoon in the Bahamas, and The Edge went into Winmore Lane Studios in Dublin with a 4-track and started messing around by himself. And it was actually him who came up. He roughed out the first shapes for New Year's Day by himself, for example. And even wrote the first lyric, although that was subsequently dumped. But it came out of, essentially it came out of The Edge's sort of preparatory work. And I think the fact that they'd hardened their resolve at the end of October, when it really did look like 3 of the members might opt for a religious life rather than a rock and roll life because they saw serious conflict between the two. And the fact that they'd made a conscious decision to stick with their music and make that their life, that's one of the things I think that made War so enormously focused and successful and strong.
There were two Bloody Sundays. There was the Bloody Sunday in 1920 and a Bloody Sunday in 1972 in both Northern and Southern Ireland. Both of those events involved the killing of a dozen or more innocent civilians by armed forces. They were horrific events, and they've scarred the Irish psyche, both of them. U2 did not address either of these Bloody Sundays directly, but they knew what the phrase meant. They knew what a loaded expression Bloody Sunday is in Ireland, but they deliberately took it away from the specifics and into a general condemnation of sectarian violence, the unrelenting cycle of sectarian violence that has dragged Ireland down for so long. They addressed this in quite an aggressive manner.
And the battle's just begun. Those many lost, tell me who has won? The trenches dug within our hearts, and mothers, children, brothers, sisters torn apart. Sunday, bloody Sunday. Sunday, bloody Sunday. How long must we sing this song? How long tonight?
Sunday Bloody Sunday is an extraordinarily bold, almost provocative opening statement. I mean, it's overtly political. It's not in any way suggestive.
Part of the song came about when the U2 were touring America, and they were asked to support the IRA hunger strikers who were imprisoned in Northern Ireland in 1982, and they resisted it. And I think that was a catalyst for them to think, well, if we're not going to show solidarity with one side or the other, because we don't believe we should show solidarity with something. And what they decided to show solidarity with was the people of Northern Ireland, those who had suffered this unrelenting cycle of sectarian violence.
Thank you, good night.
If you went to see U2 in 1983 on the War tour, you probably saw the most exciting young rock band in the world at that point. Unlike all of their contemporaries from those days, none of whom were very good live. You know, Culture Club made some wonderful records, but were absolutely piss poor live. Same with Duran Duran. You know, they had a lot of girls in the audience, young teenage girls who screamed at everything they did, and they were very fabulous concerts. but they couldn't actually hold their own in the same room as John Lee Hooker or, you know, or Blind Lemon Jefferson or even Keith Richards, you know. U2 were already well advanced down that road. In Ireland, in the mid-70s, the era they came from, you had to be really good in front of an audience. There was a great tradition in Ireland of what they call dance bands, the dancehall circuit, the show bands, and live music was a very, very popular thing in Ireland. You know, they didn't have much by the way of television and radio. You went out at night. And so in order to get going at all, they had to be very entertaining. Even when they were being very punk, they still were very, you know, Springsteen was a huge influence on them. And Springsteen, of course, famously did 3-4 hour shows and ripped his shirt open and gave it his all. And Bono was very much in that tradition. And by the time you get to the War Tour, they've got really good at it.
The reason they got to America so quickly was because they signed to Island Records, and Island had a licensing deal with Atlantic, and Atlantic always made sure that they did right by Chris Blackwell's Island signings, because in the past he delivered them up so much good stuff that if he said it was good, they'd give it a crack. So Atlantic, Warner's, whichever one it was, took the band out there to the US really quickly, and then Bono worked it, and he was climbing all over the rafters in clubs and stuff, and basically he got known for giving 110% as a stage performer, and that was part of the work ethic thing, you know, coming out in almost in physical language.
I watched U2 by then as a kind of, whereas before I'd been very taken with their enthusiasm, passion, the punk spirit which was going in there, and you knew it was a band still feeling their way, but you also knew they were going to be huge. It was funny seeing them progress. It's even funnier seeing them now, the full fruition of it all. But just watching them grow up, watching this boy grow up in front of you. What main thing is watching the rhythm section get a lot tighter. Larry and Adam, you know, I think they're underrated. They were starting to get quite funky.
Seconds marks The Edge's debut as lead vocalist with U2. The song is an anti-nuclear song, and the line, "where they dance the bomb away," actually refers to another band that was on U2's label, Island, in New York, called Trouble Funk, who had a song called Drop the Bomb. And that's where the idea for it came, and U2 took it and embellished their own ideas on it.
It could be argued that it's quite naive, and it is, you know, explicitly about nuclear war. But I guess, given this current, more increasingly precarious state of the world, its message is as relevant now as it ever was, or would have been in 1956, for example.
For an anti-nuclear song, Seconds is pretty upbeat. I mean, it's almost like you can boogie along to the apocalypse at times.
Take
There was a definite seriousness that worked very much in their favour, and although subsequently, I think, subsequent to war, U2 perhaps came to be considered to be a little too po-faced and a little too intent, a little too serious.
If you go back and look at the interviews Bono gave at the time, his whole thing at that point was trying to very much draw a line between where, you know, Bananarama and Funboy 3 and Duran Duran and that whole early 80s pop phenomenon stood. No guitars, no real drums. If you did have guitars, they were very muted, very glam, lots of makeup, lots of big hair, big shoulders. There was a very, very stylized look in 1982, which the Human League and Japan and all these other groups very much embodied. And what Bono was most intent on doing with the imagery that U2 had at that point was to do anything other than that. Anything that wasn't that was good. The Sleeve of War, with the boy with his arms raised, that was the same kid who'd been on the cover of the Boy album. They very much had to fight for that album sleeve. As far as the record company were concerned, you know, this was a deeply uncommercial image to try and sell an album that, from the record company's point of view, was purpose-built to be a hit internationally. They had already had hits in Britain and Ireland. That's not what the game was about anymore from a record company point of view. As of now, the game is to move it forward and break this band into as many territories internationally as possible. Clearly they're a great live band, clearly they can write hits, clearly the potential is there to do exactly that. At a time when most punk bands were rubbish live, had no interest in being internationally famous, just wanted to be on the cover of the NME. The great advantage U2 had is that they were Irish, and in Ireland, America has never been uncool. You know, America is where you go to get the hell out of Ireland. I speak as an Irish person, so I can tell you this. You know, Australia, America, and the mainland, as we call it, Britain, that's what you do. Whereas in London, and the punk ethos was, oh, America's a terrible place, and we don't even want Paul Weller, oh, I'm not even going to go there. You know, no. U2 couldn't wait to go there. Anybody that had released New Year's Day would have had a hit with it at that point. And more importantly, anybody that hadn't been that terribly interested in U2 up until that point suddenly had to say, I really like that track New Year's Day. That's a great track, regardless of who recorded it. And so kind of inadvertently, as the lead-off single for the album, it did a tremendous job. It more or less pushed that album into the US top 20. It very much guaranteed that War would become their first #1 album in Britain.
I think it's the best track. I mean, it's a fantastic song. It was obviously the lead single off the album. And I just think the Edge's guitar sounds wonderful. I mean, it can be forgotten just how good a guitar player the Edge is. I think if you took Edge out of U2, what you'd have basically is a pretty bog-standard rock band with a vocalist trying really hard to tackle big issues, and we all know how wary and that kind of thing can be. It's the edges guitar that really lifts U2 to a much higher level, I think, personally.
War is definitely of its time, but if you listen to the playing on New Year's Day, it's not just about that, big widescreen Bono chorus. It's about those bass riffs going on underneath and that little bit of guitar that curls up. They're very attention to detail. I think that Steve Lillywhite was a very good producer. I mean, I'd encountered him. He'd done Johnny Thunders' album in 1978, so he could handle anything. He'd also done Susie and the Banshees, so he'd managed to get them a really good studio sound, which they had problems with sometimes.
What you can hear when you listen to War is that the band has made 2 albums. They've worked with a very good producer. And he has taught them that you don't need to be playing everything all the time. He's taught them that less is more. So what they are now doing is being very definite about what they're playing and making sure that not only is it being played very nicely and cleanly, but they're relaxed enough with it so that they can sort of hang back into it a bit, and it's not right on the edge. It's not right on the edge of their talent anymore. And I mean, that is one of the things which happens to a band when it's in terms of its maturity. They start off, most young bands start off, and everybody is working right at the stretch of their capabilities because they're frightened that if they don't play like this, it'll all stop. And it's when you suddenly realise that all you need to do is do that and wait for 4 beats that can be more effective by far. And by the time we've got to War, both Larry and Adam are, they have confidence in themselves. They know how to play as a unit, and even though they may be a tiny bit unorthodox, their unorthodoxy is at the root of what U2 are all about. If U2 had a really solid, traditional copybook rhythm section, they would be boring. And would have been boring from the beginning. One of the things, and by the same token, if they had a really ordinary, capable guitar player, but in the orthodox mode, they'd have been good, but they wouldn't have been special. What makes U2 special is that the Edge plays hugely unusual style guitar, and the rhythm section behind him, because he's not playing set chords and stuff, so they've got to be following him exactly, they are able to be a step sideways. So musically, everything in U2 is always slightly a step sideways from what would be the norm. And then on top of that, you have Bono, who is, giving it, he's going somewhere on the psychic plane with it.
Two Hearts Beat as One is certainly a lighter moment on the album. Musically, it came from the group simply kicking back, jamming, coming up with a nice melody, seeing where it went. Lyrically, Bono wrote it very much about his relationship with his wife, who'd been his childhood sweetheart. They'd met at school. They're still together today, 30 years later. Very strong lady in her own right, very big influence on Bono's life, after his mother died, as a teenager particularly. So But you know, there are other tracks on the album. There are many tracks on the album that are about that relationship. If you look at the lyrics, Bono still to this day maintains that most of the songs on War are love songs in one form or another. However, the Two Hearts Beaters one is clearly an obvious love song. I'd say a very good love song, and again a brave moment, because you know, it's easy to be, in those days, very angry and very punk. It can be very easy to be very strident and what's wrong with the world and let's put it all right, you know. But to actually just come out and say I love you without sounding incredibly cheesy, that itself is an accomplishment. And I think, you know, we have to remember as well, they were very young still. They were, you know, in their early 20s. So I think that was a really very accomplished pop moment, if you like.
Edge actually tops it off. He puts some really nice Technicolor flashes of guitar above the rhythms that really carries the song along. But I guess maybe in retrospect they might have slowed it down a bit. They would probably have got more out of it.
Beat on black, beat on white, beat on everything tonight. I don't know how to say what's got to be said. I don't know if it's black or white. There's others in red.
What I find with Bono and U2 is he's often struggling to express the inexpressible, find the words to say this ultimate statement. And I think in the song he says, I can't find the words to say to you that shows how I feel, but he's really going to try, and he's breathing so hard to try and get these words across. And also there is the theory that the subtext of the song is a love between a Catholic and a Protestant. Obviously, to have this sectarian divide in Ireland was a very difficult thing to have a relationship in those days particularly. And there are lines about, is it just black and white? Some people see it as red, who see it as inflammatory. So I think even with U2's love song, there was a political undertone sometimes.
The city's alight with lovers and lies, bright blue eyes. Oh, the city is bright, it's bright open day tonight. Surrender, surrender.
One of the intriguing things about the War album is that it sort of bridges the gap between where they were with Boy and with October and where they will get to with the Joshua Tree. And so there's little hints of the Joshua Tree in there. One of them is particularly in Surrender, which you listen to it now, and there's little bits of Bullet the Blue Sky all over it. There's little, you know, sort of cadences and stops and starts and dynamics and things like that. And it's just, it's Bullet the Blue Sky in waiting.
It could be tonight, it won't be tomorrow, it could be tonight.
There's some great pulsating rhythms on Surrender that really drive the song along. And it was also the kind of song that when they performed live, they could open it out and explore it and see where it took them. It's one of those that they could just let go a bit and it would do something on stage. And they could take that and then they'd reel it back in again to finish it.
It's in the things I do and say, never wanna live, I gotta die to myself someday.
I think Surrender is one of those typically U2 songs which artists of all different backgrounds always claim to write songs that work on a number of different levels. This track definitely works on a number of different levels. In terms of the concept of war, surrender clearly has a particular resonance. In terms of a spiritual aspect, surrender again has a very particular resonance, surrendering to a higher power, surrendering to love, making allowances for the bigger picture, understanding that whatever one's viewpoint, it isn't necessarily the only viewpoint. But of course then there's the musical aspect, which is the sweetest of all in a way, so that whatever the song meant to Bono while he was writing the lyrics, ultimately it simply works as a really good song. It simply works as a great track, and whatever he's actually talking about, it's a very easy track to become involved in and to find yourself being taken along with. There's always going to be a gap in the market for a fantastic rock band with great songs. And U2 were able to prove, just as the Stones had, just as the Beatles had, just as all the best rock bands ever had proved, you can have great hit singles with great songs, you can do great albums that have hit singles on them, you can do fabulous tours and be incredibly successful but still be taken seriously. It's the old have your cake and eat it. And if there's one thing about Bono which you absolutely have to understand, this is probably the most ambitious rock star that has ever lived. I mean, beyond John Lennon, beyond Elvis Presley. You know, John Lennon and Elvis Presley, there was nobody before them for them to look at and establish a precedent with. You know, Bono's been able to say, well, Presley was the most famous and the most successful. Lennon was the most politicised. I want to be both, and I want to be more. So now, you know, 25 years on, we've got a guy who has Nelson Mandela on his speed dial, who has President Bush on his speed dial, has Tony Blair to come and stay at his house in Dublin. All this, the roots of all this, go right back to the War album. And not just songs like New Year's Day and Sunday Bloody Sunday, but the clear line Bono drew in the sand which said, yes, we're going to be very successful, yes, our singles are going to be very catchy, but what we sing about and what we do are all spiritual, emotional, political ideas that go way beyond the pop aesthetic and right into the heart of what we in the 70s used to call rock. Is the song that closes the album, and in fact refers back to the first song, Sunday Bloody Sunday. And it takes the refrain from Sunday Bloody Sunday, how long must we sing this song, and switches it slightly. The words come from Psalm 40 from the Bible. I have waited patiently for the Lord, how long to sing this song. Slightly different emphasis on there, but it means much the same thing, and it's much more of a declaration of faith. While Sunday Bloody Sunday was
a protest for peace, 40 is much more of a declaration from U2. It's a gentler resolution to the album, certainly in view of all the struggle and strife that's gone on through the rest of the album. And it brings it to a very satisfactory close in that sense.
I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song. To sing this song.
Where it became even more interesting though was when they began performing the song live, because at that point the very kind of chanty, building, anthemic nature of the track encouraged audiences to join in essentially, which of course Bono then encouraged them to do. And what began as a fairly inconsequential last-minute idea eventually and quite quickly built towards one of the big moments in their live show in that era. And of course people read this extra significance into it because of the, reprising the line from Sunday, Bloody Sunday. In fact, that wasn't such a big deal. It was just a handy way for Bono to kind of cyclically tie up some loose ends. But live it took on all kinds of meanings, as the Bible tends to do. The Bible is almost a blank in which people put their own interpretations into it, and so live it was almost the perfect U2 vehicle because they could extend it for hours if they wanted to, and the audience themselves could become very, very involved, and you get this very kind of cathartic crescendo of a moment.